So I'm Jason Tibbetts, and for my MCS project, I built an adaptive framework to assist in the co-creative development of sustainable community food systems. So my project partner is Eden Institute, which is a business that I built about 10 years ago, and 20 years of experience in the landscaping industry in the Phoenix area. The goal is beautiful yards that produce food and pay for themselves, with an emphasis on ecological design. And right now, the reason why this project is so valuable to the company right now is because they're rebranding transition from individual consulting to large-scale community development. And so what I set out to do originally was to compare existing community intervention strategies and identify leverage points where a community food system could be introduced, ultimately, so that I could create some sort of a Frankenstein-type protocol for building community food systems and address food. And the overall arching purpose was to address food insecurity and sustainable landscapes. And so I did a lot of research, a lot of material, and most of what I did was actually compare written materials. I did do some traveling around, meeting people and professionals and such on sites. But I took those materials and assessed their strengths, their weaknesses, and where they would fit in some sort of a intervention process. And so this is ultimately, wow, the color's different. Ultimately, the basic framework that I developed as far as that process goes. Phase one, observation and inspiration, is largely building relationships with individuals within the community, and also identifying any strengths and weaknesses, and just a lot of observation issues. And phase two, formation mobilization, is really about bringing people together and developing visioning processes and visioning what they want in their community. Phase three, ultimately this project was heavily influenced by asset-based community development, which looks at the assets of the community rather than the problems of the community and what they actually have to offer the process going forward. And so asset inventories take place in this phase, as well as any other organization and planning for that specific community. And then implementation of pilot projects, which will kind of feed into this process of calibrating future iterations and then ultimately on how to intensify this process and scale it from individual community projects, multiple community projects, to multiple communities, which I already went over there. So initial contact, building relationships of trust, listening sessions, organizing focus groups, visioning workshops, asset inventory, what they have. So this process is essentially looking at what do they want, what do they have, and how do they get there. And ultimately, so also in the calibration, using system dynamics modeling or some sort of tool like that can definitely influence this process. I looked at some other methods of calibration of this process too. Looking at the system, I really wanted to dive in and understand the community system as a whole. So I looked at the 6 types of capital, and I expanded out from there to understand basically what a community system looks like as far as how it's built and the pieces within that system. But my focus was on the food system and ultimately on edible landscaping as a piece. The other aspect that I looked into a lot was food markets, but ultimately I focused in on edible landscaping. Food markets because there has to be a mechanism to pay for this so that it's actually financially sustainable. So these are the individual pieces within this. And what I noticed most about this was that these are roles. These are individuals who have interests and skills in these particular areas. And without every piece, these food systems, these communities are having to rely on outside entities in order to sustain their food process. This is ultimately looking at how do we take this large aggregated food system and shrink it down so that they can become micro aggregated food systems that are all independently sustainable, largely. And so there had to be essentially individuals within each piece. And so Eden Institute, the purpose is to kind of work through this process of educating, helping people through this process building the system out. And then the other aspects were essentially resources and models, systems. Residential landscaping system. This largely comes from field experience of Eden Institute, and this can essentially be looked at as a base order system on step-by-step process. Almost always starting with observation. Even in permaculture literature, everything starts with observation. Observing what is there, what is available, and how to and what that system looks like over time, and how to model that system. So in all of this, there's a few key components in working with individuals and communities that can't be ignored. You have to go through this process with love and an open heart and identify existing knowledge that the community has. And without a humble disposition, you can't build that trust with communities and individuals. Without that trust, nobody comes to meetings and nothing happens. And so setting expectations up front is essential, and maintaining a co-creative environment. And ultimately, one of the main goals is to forfeit control of this process, because we want them to take ownership of the end result of the food system. It's their food system. So the accomplishments: ultimately, I reviewed and analyzed existing frameworks and protocols, identified effective community intervention strategies. I learned what goes into building holistic community intervention frameworks and protocols, which was way more than I had originally realized. And I designed frameworks that represented each of the three types of systems. And I think most importantly for me, I identified strengths where my skills can be applied, and I came to realize that I don't work best in the upfront initial foundational framework of community development. Rather, my position and my skill set is better at relationship building and fine-tuning this process. So I acknowledge that there's a limited time frame. This is something that became very clear to me as I had so much material that I was going over, and so many goals with this MSUS project with a limited amount of time frame, which also had to do with the MSUS reporting demands, which I had to scale back on what I was doing in order to make room for the MSUS deliverables. Recognizing community system complexity was part of that in that process, and I needed to focus on the basics. And probably the most important is co-designing custom community protocols with residents. Instead of building a protocol, which is what I set out to do, I built framework, which feeds into the protocol and how a community custom protocol works. So moving forward, this process will be used foundationally to develop custom community protocols, and Eden Institute is working on building a nonprofit to fund backyard projects, and also provide the foundation for working in communities at different scales. I scaled back what I was originally planning on doing with building this community assets map, which is a good foundation. So there is room for other students to work here in coming up with this assets map, which is basically a geospatial game that you work with in the community. And I also built this community protocol. There was a lot that went into that. There's about 40 pages that still need to be reviewed and added to. And individually, each community still needs a custom protocol. So there's a lot that I learned in this process.